Well, we begin today with yet another military scandal coming out of Afghanistan involving U.S. soldiers, photos, and Afghan corpses. Yes, again. Now, today's revelations come from the LA Times, which published grisly images of troops from the 82nd Airborne Division posing, sometimes grinning, next to the remains of Afghan insurgents. Now, the photos are from 2010, but it seems like almost every single month a new scandal emerges that somehow involves U.S. soldiers or NATO forces committing one atrocity or another in the field of war. Marines urinating on corpses, accidental burnings of the Quran, shooting sprees, the list goes on. Now, in this specific case, the military response seems to be to place the blame on the press, more or less. Now, the Pentagon made the usual noises about how this doesn't represent the conduct of the military as a whole, and then issued the usual warnings about how the release of such images jeopardizes U.S. lives by leaving a bad impression on, quote, the minds of local Afghans. Because local Afghans have such a favorable view of America after a decade of war, night raids, torture, and civilian killings. Now, these acts were despicable, yes, but the discussion in the media and among the Pentagon officials seems to miss the point. America is at war, has been at war. For more than a decade, soldiers have been sent over and over again to foreign lands to do what they are trained to do, to fight and to kill. And what this has resulted in is a generation of American men and women who have fought, some who have died, some who have lost limbs, some who have watched friends die, all in the name of war. And they come back, and when they come back, they have scars, seen and unseen. Let me run through some of the statistics that might explain some of these behaviors. A U.S. soldier dies every single day and a half on average in Iraq or Afghanistan. U.S. veterans kill themselves at a rate of 1 every 80 minutes. And more than 6,500 U.S. veteran suicides are logged every year. Now, just for background, that's more than the total number of soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan combined since the start of those wars. Now, we can debate about the role of the media and the effect that these photos may have on local Afghans till they're blue in the face, but we need to stop treating them as isolated incidents and admit that this is what war does. Now, I haven't seen war firsthand, but my next guest has. He's fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Retired U.S. Marine Jake DeLiberto. Welcome back to the program, and it's great to see you in the flesh.
Thanks, Lucy.
Jake, as someone who knows what we're talking about, not in the abstract, you've been in war zones, you've fought, you've seen what conflict does. What's your reaction to this latest scandal?
Well, this is something to keep in mind here. There's two distinctly different things occurring. I think that these most recent pictures, the peeing on the corpses and the burning of the Qurans, as well as the incident with Robert Bales, is a broad list of things that have happened in every single war. And I think that the viewers of this program would be wise, and American people would be wise to know that the behavior, as bad as it has been, this is not as nearly as bad as it has been in previous wars. When the Afghans were engaged in the 1980s, they had a lot of bad behavior. When the Americans were engaged in Vietnam, the Vietnamese had bad behavior. The Nazis in World War II. War brings about the worst of human behavior. And I would say the things I've seen worst haven't been when I was in serving the military, but as a civilian, working in places like Israel, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, seeing what goes on to civilians. On the civilian side, it's much worse than it is on the military side. For instance, every bomb that's dropped, there are innocent civilians that get killed. That brings up all sorts of problems for the society at large. And then the soldiers that are engaged in a war as well, the dehumanization process that takes place, the psychological damage, troops can only take that for so long. And we're seeing at this point, I think, within the U.S. ranks, a breaking, a shattering of discipline. And I think there needs to be some general rethinking about this whole thing about open-ended war.
And these men and women are coming home eventually. I mean, how should we be concerned about their ability to readjust if this is what a decade of war has done to our men and women in arms?
There is no doubt that those who entered the civilian life coming from the military have the hardest psychological challenge to enter back into civilian life. I mean, I only served 4 years in the Marines, so in many regard, my service is nothing compared to some of the people that have been doing it for much longer. But even after only serving 4 years, I can say that it's so hard for us to interculate back into civilian society, learning basic things, humor, jokes, cultural norms, the kinds of things we would say in the military we would never say in the civilian world. And also, it's being able to parse out how to be critical of policies for war, and then also how to be able to support our brothers, and then be able to reflect on this entire political nightmare known as the War on Terror or the Long War,
whatever you want to use. And that's sort of the issue here, because whether we're talking about, Chinese troops, Soviet troops in Afghanistan, American troops, war is ugly and war does do terrible things. And I'm sure that these photos don't even represent, the slightest half of what potentially goes on in the field. But the problem is that we, as a country here, unfortunately have been engaged not just in Afghanistan, but in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, in all of these other countries. And, we have a society that, for example, movies, video games, all of this sort of desensitizes and engages us in this perspective that, kill or be killed.
Yes, ma'am. You nailed it. It's interesting. America in all reality starts out as an idea. The idea of the Constitution, these ideas that are espoused by the founders. When we start having a nation that is tolerant of torture, or a political class here that's tolerant of open-ended war, or a society that's removed from what our soldiers are doing abroad. When you start to have those sorts of societal breakdowns, America loses its identity. So what the founders anticipated isn't there anymore.
Have we lost our way?
America, unfortunately, for better or for worse, has forgotten its identity. We have capitulated into a new generation where the nation that the founders identified doesn't exist anymore. The society at large isn't engaged in what our soldiers are doing abroad. And Washington seems to be so broken that no one knows what they're doing. They're so far removed from the day-to-day crises that's occurring in Cleveland, Ohio, or Seattle, or wherever else. And not only what's worst of all that, the people that are in Seattle and Cleveland are removed from what our troops are going through in Kabul and Baghdad and everywhere else.
But the thing is, the military doesn't consist of 10,000 people. I mean, we're talking, if you combine veterans and active service men, et cetera, millions of people, millions of Americans, right?
Yeah.
And you're almost pitting these two separate cultures. The society, part of our society that's removed from all this warfare, and the society that's been forced and exposed to these horrors. Could there be a potential, some sort of clash or some sort of difficulty in readjusting down the line?
Well, maybe that's the case, but I think even a bigger crisis, Lucy. When the draft existed before 1976, the nation was forced to engage in what Washington decided. We were forced to because the draft was there to keep us in check. With the draft ending in 1976, there is no way that the nation's forced to be engaged in war. So it's easier to go to war, it's easier to stay at war, and it's almost impossible to end the wars, whatever war it is, once it gets started. We still have troops in Bosnia. We still have troops, bases, if you will, in Iraq. Maybe not uniformed soldiers, but we still have this thing in Afghanistan going, for better or for worse. I don't really care what the nation's opinion is about the war, because everybody's entitled to different opinions. But the nation needs to be involved, engaged in what we're doing. And it's not engaged because it's not forced to.
And it's only when incidents like this come out that we even pay attention to this. Now, Jake, I want to ask sort of a more personal question. Again, you've served in both conflicts. I know it's not necessarily as long as some of our men and women have, but you've seen this firsthand. I also know that you've gotten a degree in theology. You've turned to religion. I'm curious, has what you've seen on the ground forced you towards more of a spiritual path, I guess, to try to deal with what you've experienced?
I think that religion, faith, whether it's Muslim, Christianity, doesn't matter, has a way of unifying people, as a way of connecting and see that there's a creator who connected people, from my point of view. And that I find human rights abuses intolerable in any way, shape, or form. And religion has been a form of therapy for me, I think. And so certainly, for me, it's fundamentally changed my life. And I think that a lot of soldiers, veterans are coming back from these wars, are turning to it just as well as they did before. People can say religion's a reason for wars, and maybe that's the case. But religion is also a profound way of peace and reconciliation. You saw this with Martin Luther King, you saw this with Gandhi, that sort of thing. So, yeah, religion means a lot to me.
Well, perhaps when you don't have the option to turn to the VA or the Pentagon for help when you return, spiritual help might be what works for some folks. Jake, I really want to thank you for spending time with us and sharing your personal experiences.
Thank you,
as well.
Lucy.
Thank you. That was Jake DeLiberto, retired U.S. Marine and RT blogger.